Hello, everyone. If you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share.
The girl with one suitcase. You know that and every word around you sounds like music you don't understand? That was me. My name is Mai, and I arrived in America with exactly one bag, $300, and an English vocabulary that could barely order a cup of coffee. But here's the thing that nobody tells you about learning a new language while trying to build a new life. It's not really about the words at all. It's about the courage to sound stupid, the patience to stumble through every sentence, and the strange, beautiful magic of being misunderstood and still choosing to stay. You see, I didn't come to America for a job. I didn't come for money or fame. I came because I was running away from a broken promise, a shattered heart, and a version of myself that I no longer recognized. And somewhere between the frozen streets of Chicago and the warm glow of a tiny bookstore on a rainy Tuesday, I found something I never expected, not just a new language, but a new way to love, a new way to be loved. And a new way to believe that even the most broken pieces can form something breathtakingly whole. Let me take you back to the beginning because every story needs a starting point, and mine starts with a goodbye that tasted like regret. I was 27 years old when I left Vietnam. I had been married for 5 years to a man who promised me forever, but forever turned out to be just another word he didn't mean. He told me I wasn't enough, that I couldn't give him what he wanted, that my dreams were too big and my English was too small. So, I packed my life into a single suitcase and bought a one-way ticket to the United States. A country I only knew from movies and the broken English of my high school textbooks. I remember sitting on the plane, staring at the clouds through the tiny window and thinking, Mai, what are you doing? You can barely say please and thank you without messing up the pronunciation. But something inside me whispered, go. Even if you fail, at least you will fail trying. And isn't that the most terrifying and wonderful thing about starting over? You have no guarantee of success, but you also have no guarantee of failure. You simply have the chance to try. My first few weeks in America were a blur of confusion, cold weather, and cultural shock that hit me harder than a Chicago winter wind. I rented a small room in a shared apartment with 3 other immigrants, each of us clinging to our own versions of the American dream while struggling with the same basic problem. We didn't speak the language well enough to ask for help. My room was barely big enough for a bed and a small desk, but I made it my sanctuary. Every night, I would watch American television with subtitles, pausing every few seconds to write down unfamiliar words. I would repeat sentences under my breath like a prayer, hoping that someday the sounds would feel natural. I would listen to conversations on the bus, trying to catch bits and pieces, feeling like a detective piecing together a mystery. And I would cry because, let's be honest, learning a language when you're 30,000 feet away from everyone you know is not just hard, it's lonely. It's the kind of lonely that sits in your chest like a stone, heavy and immovable. Especially at 2 a.m. when you can't sleep and you're thinking about your mother's voice and the smell of her cooking. But here's what I discovered during those long, cold months. The brain is a remarkable thing. Science tells us that our brains are wired for connection, for understanding, for finding patterns in chaos. When you're forced to learn a new language, your brain doesn't just memorize words. It creates new pathways, builds new bridges between sounds and meanings, and slowly rewires itself to help you survive. Neuroscientists call this neuroplasticity, but I call it the miracle of not giving up. Every day, I would force myself to speak to cashiers at the grocery store, even though my hands would shake and my face would flush with embarrassment. Every day, I would order my coffee in English, even though the barista often looked confused. Every day, I would say "excuse me" to strangers on the street, hoping that the words would eventually feel like my own. And slowly, Painfully beautifully they did. One thing I noticed about America that surprised me was how kind people could be to someone who was clearly struggling. In Vietnam, I was used to people being patient with my Vietnamese because it was my native language. But here, when I spoke English with a thick accent and imperfect grammar, people would often smile and say, "Don't worry, I understand you." They would slow down their speech. They would offer help. They would share their own stories of learning English or their parents' stories of coming to this country with nothing but hope. It was in those small moments that I began to understand something important. Language is not about perfection. It's about connection. It's about the willingness to be vulnerable, to say the wrong thing, to laugh at yourself, and to keep trying anyway. There was a particularly cold day in February when I found myself standing outside a small bookstore called The Reader's Nook. I had been walking home from a job interview that went terribly. My interviewer had asked me about my experience, and I had accidentally said the word experience as experiment. And he had looked at me with that polite but pitying expression that I was starting to recognize. I felt defeated. I wanted to go back to my tiny room and hide under my blanket and pretend I had never left Vietnam. But the bookstore window caught my eye and I saw a sign that said, "All books, 50% off." Now, I had always loved books. In Vietnam, I had a small collection of English novels that I bought just to practice reading, even though I could barely understand half the words. So I walked inside, not knowing that this decision would change my entire life. The moment I entered, I smelled paper, wood, and something warm and comforting like cinnamon. There were shelves everywhere, stacked with books of every color and size. I walked through the aisles, running my fingers over the spines, feeling the weight of stories I couldn't yet understand. And then I heard a voice behind me say, "Are you looking for something specific?" I turned around and there he was, a tall man with a gentle smile, holding a small, messy-haired boy in his arms. The man had kind eyes, the kind that look like they've seen a lot of pain and chosen to be soft anyway. The boy was about 6 years old, with a gap-toothed grin and an energy that seemed to bounce off the walls. I froze, because not only was I embarrassed by my terrible English, but I also had no idea what to say. My brain felt like a calculator with a dead battery. I wanted to say, "I am just looking," but the words wouldn't come. So I did the only thing I could. I pointed at a random book and said, "This one." The man smiled, and I noticed his eyes crinkled at the corners. He said, "That's a great book. It's about a girl who travels the world alone. Very inspiring." I nodded, pretending I understood, but the truth was, I couldn't even read the title properly. That was my first real conversation with my future husband, and it was a disaster. He slowed down his speech. He explained words I didn't understand, and he introduced me to his son, whose name was Leo. Leo looked at me with curious eyes and asked, "Do you like stories?" I said, "I like stories very much." It was a simple sentence. Imperfect. Childlike. But it was the most honest thing I had said since I arrived in America. Here's what I want you to understand, especially if you're struggling with English right now. Feeling like you'll never get it right. Every expert started exactly where you are. Every fluent speaker had a first day, a first word, a first sentence that made no sense. Linguists tell us that it takes anywhere from 6 months to several years to become comfortable in a new language. But here's the secret that nobody tells you. You don't have to be fluent to connect. You just have to be real. You just have to be willing to be seen exactly as you are, with your mistakes and your accent and your confusion. The brain, by the way, is actually designed to learn language better when you're relaxed. There's a reason why the best conversations happen when you're not trying so hard. Studies in neurolinguistics show that stress releases cortisol, which literally blocks the brain's ability to form new memories and process language. So when you're scared and you're worrying about every single word, you're actually making it harder for yourself. The irony, right? The more you relax, the more you learn. And the more you accept your mistakes, the faster you grow. So standing in that little bookstore, smelling old paper and cinnamon, I made a decision that would change everything. I decided to stop being afraid. I decided to let myself make mistakes. I decided to trust that this man, with his kindness and his small son, would not judge me for my broken English. I told him my name was Mai. I told him I was from Vietnam. I told him I was learning English and sometimes it was very hard. And he said, "My name is Michael. And my son Leo, we're learning too. We're learning how to live without his mother." The words hung in the air, honest and heavy. And somehow, in that moment, two broken people and one curious child found each other. I walked out of that bookstore with a book I couldn't fully read, a phone number written on a receipt, and a feeling I hadn't felt in years: hope. Because if there was one thing I was learning, it was that America wasn't just a country of fast food and big cities. It was a country of second chances. A place where even someone with a single suitcase and a heart full of broken English could build a new life, one clumsy sentence at a time. Now, you might be wondering, Mai, what happened next? Did you call him? Did you see him again? What happened with Leo and the stepmom thing? But that, my friends, is a story for another section. Because every story needs room to breathe, and every heart needs time to trust. What I can tell you is this: the journey of learning English is never really about the language. It's about learning to trust yourself, learning to trust others, and realizing that some of the most beautiful love stories are written in the simplest words. So if you're out there, struggling with your English, feeling like you'll never get it right, please don't give up. Your accent is beautiful. Your effort is heroic. And your story is just beginning. In the next section, I'll take you deeper into my journey, what it felt like to face my first American winter alone, the small victories I celebrated, and how I learned that sometimes the best way to heal a broken heart is to let someone else see your scars. But for now, I want you to pause and reflect. When was the last time you felt afraid to speak? And what did you do? Because the truth is, courage isn't the absence of fear. It's looking at your fear and saying, "You're not the boss of me." And that, my friends, is the first step to learning anything worth knowing. The winter of silence. Remember how I told you about that magical moment in the bookstore when I met Michael and his son Leo? And I walked out with a book I couldn't fully read and a phone number written on a receipt? Well, here's the thing about hope. It doesn't always protect you from what comes next. That night, I went back to my tiny room, sat on the edge of my bed, and stared at that receipt for 3 whole hours. 3 hours, my friends. I held it in my hands like it was made of gold, but I didn't call. I couldn't. Because calling meant speaking English on the phone, with no facial expressions to help me, no gestures to fill in the gaps. Calling meant risking sounding so stupid that he would regret ever giving me that number. So I did what I always did when fear took over. I put the receipt in a drawer, opened my English textbook, and spent the night repeating vocabulary words until my throat hurt. That was my life in those early days, a quiet war between the desire to connect and the terror of being misunderstood. The winter of my first year in America was brutal in ways I never expected. You see, I grew up in a tropical country where the coldest day of the year was still warm enough to wear a t-shirt. But Chicago in February? Chicago in February laughs at your tropical memories. The cold didn't just touch my skin. It seemed to seep into my bones, into my thoughts, into my very soul. I remember waking up each morning to the sound of wind howling against my window, and I would lie there under my thin blanket, counting the seconds before I had to get up and face another day of feeling invisible. Because that's the thing about not speaking a language well, you become invisible. You become a ghost in your own life. You walk through grocery stores and people rush past you. You take the bus and nobody makes eye contact. You stand in lines and you feel like you're disappearing. Like you could say anything or nothing and it wouldn't matter because nobody really hears you anyway. Now, I know some of you might be thinking, why didn't you just go home? Why didn't you give up? And honestly, I ask myself that question every single day. Sometimes multiple times a day. Especially at night, when the loneliness felt like a physical weight on my chest. I would video call my mother back in Vietnam, and she would look at me through the screen with those worried eyes and say, "Come home, my daughter. It's not too late." But something in me refused. Something stubborn and proud, and maybe a little bit foolish, kept saying, "Not yet. I'm not done trying." And that's the thing about learning a new language or rebuilding a broken life. It's not a straight line. It's not even a wavy line. It's like trying to draw a circle while riding a unicycle during an earthquake. It's messy, unpredictable, and occasionally makes you want to scream into your pillow. Let me share something scientific with you that helped me understand my own struggles. When we learn a new language as adults, our brains are doing something extraordinary called cognitive restructuring. This means that our neural pathways, which have been wired for our native language since birth, have to literally rearrange themselves to accommodate new sounds, new grammar rules, and new ways of expressing thought. And here's where it gets interesting. This process actually uses the same brain regions that handle emotional regulation. So when you're feeling stressed or anxious about speaking English, you're not just fighting a language barrier. You're fighting your own nervous system. It's like trying to learn a dance while someone is setting off fireworks next to you. Your brain is constantly in survival mode, and survival mode is not learning mode. The amygdala, which is the part of your brain that processes fear, literally hijacks your prefrontal cortex, the part that processes language, whenever you feel threatened. So the more afraid you are of making mistakes, the more mistakes you'll make. It's one of the cruelest ironies of the human brain. But here's what I started to realize during those long, silent winter nights. I couldn't make my fear disappear, but I could learn to move with it. I started treating my English practice like meditation. I would sit in my tiny room with a cup of tea, open a simple children's book, and read aloud to myself, very slowly. I wouldn't worry about the accent. I wouldn't worry about the grammar. I would just let the words flow out of my mouth like water, warm and imperfect. And something remarkable happened. The more I practiced like this, the less anxious I felt. It's like the science says, you have to turn off the alarm system before you can build anything new. I also discovered the power of what I call tiny victories. These were the moments that nobody else would notice, but that felt huge to me. For example, one day I was at a grocery store buying milk and the cashier said, "Have a nice day." And instead of just nodding, I said, "You too." Just 2 words. 2 simple words that didn't even require any complex grammar. But as I walked out of that store, I felt like I had climbed a mountain. I had responded. I had participated. I had been seen. Another time, I managed to ask a neighbor where the nearest post office was, and she understood me. She actually pointed down the street and said, 2 blocks that way. I didn't understand what 2 blocks meant at first. I had to look it up later, but I felt a thrill of connection that I hadn't felt since I left.
Vietnam.
You know what else helped me survive that winter? The book I bought from the bookstore. The one I couldn't fully read. It was called The Blue Butterfly, a simple story about a girl who travels alone across Europe. I read it every night, 1 page at a time. I underlined words I didn't know and looked them up. I read sentences out loud, then read them again, trying to mimic the rhythm. By the time I finished that book, I had memorized entire passages. I could recite them in my sleep. And each time I read a word that I had previously stumbled over, I felt a small crack of light in the darkness. Because that's what learning a language is, isn't it? It's not about grand leaps. It's about tiny cracks, tiny openings, tiny moments where the light gets in. But let me be honest with you, even with all my tiny victories, the winter was still long and cold. I cried a lot. I cried in the shower where nobody could hear me. I cried on the bus while staring out the window. I cried because I missed my mother's cooking, the sound of my language, the feeling of being understood without having to explain. I cried because I had a phone number in my drawer that I was too afraid to call. I cried because I had let a man who didn't deserve me destroy my confidence, and I didn't know how to get it back. But here's a pattern I noticed. Every time I cried, I felt a little better afterward. And I realized that sadness isn't the enemy of learning. It's actually part of it. Emotions are like waves. You can't stop them, but you can learn to surf. Scientists have actually studied the relationship between language learning and emotion, and they've found that people who allow themselves to feel their emotions while learning, who cry, who laugh, who get frustrated and then forgive themselves, actually learn faster than people who try to stay neutral. Because language is emotional. It's full of feeling. And if you're not allowing yourself to feel, you're not really learning. You're just memorizing. The other thing that kept me going was a simple promise I made to myself. Every day, learn one new word and use it in a sentence. That was it. One word, one sentence. I didn't try to do too much because I had already learned that trying to do too much was a recipe for burnout. I would pick a word like cozy or gentle or courage, and I would practice saying it in every possible way. This room is cozy. He has a gentle smile. I need courage to call him. And you know what happened after about 3 weeks of this? That phone number in my drawer started calling to me. Not literally, of course, but I started feeling braver. I started feeling like maybe I could actually say a few words without completely humiliating myself. One night, I sat down with the phone in my hand, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I had written a little script on a piece of paper. Hello, this is Mai. I met you at the bookstore. I wanted to say thank you for the book recommendation. Simple, right? But my hands were shaking. My throat was closing up. I took 3 deep breaths, just like my mother used to tell me to do before exams. And then I dialed the number. I didn't think about what could go wrong. I just pressed the buttons and listened to the ringing. And he answered. My heart nearly exploded. I opened my mouth to speak, but what came out was not what I had practiced. Instead of my neat little script, I said, Hi.
Mai.
Bookstore. You gave me number. I am sorry for my English. It was a disaster of grammar and awkwardness. But his voice on the other end? He said, Mai. I was hoping you would call. How are you? Did you start reading the book? He spoke slowly, clearly, with a kindness that felt like a warm blanket on a cold night. And I realized in that moment that the script didn't matter. What mattered was that I had called. What mattered was that I had tried. And what mattered most of all was that he had waited for my call. That call was only 5 minutes long. I used about 50 words, and at least 10 of them were wrong. But when I hung up, I felt like I had just run a marathon. I felt like I had crossed a finish line I didn't even know existed. I had done something terrifying, and I had survived. More than survived, I had thrived. And I knew, deep down, that this was just the beginning. That if I could make that phone call, I could do other hard things too. I could learn more English. I could build a new life. I could even, maybe someday, learn to love again. That winter was still cold, and it still had many lonely nights ahead. But something had shifted inside me. The silence wasn't so scary anymore, because I had heard his voice, and his voice was like a promise. The promise that someone out there saw me, heard me, and didn't care about my broken English. And if he could do that, maybe I could learn to see myself the same way. In the next part, I'll tell you about our first real date, the beautiful chaos of blending two cultures. And the moment I realized that love doesn't need perfect grammar to be understood. But for now, remember this, every expert was once a beginner. Every fluent speaker was once lost for words. And every brave act starts with just one small, terrifying step. Take that step, my friends. Your story is waiting. The Bookstore Encounter. I'm going to tell you something that I've never told anyone before, not even Michael. When I hung up that phone after our first call, I didn't just feel happy, I felt terrified. Because I had been in relationships before. I had been married before. And every time I opened my heart, it felt like someone handed me a map and said, "Here's how you'll get lost." So when Michael said, "Let's meet for coffee this weekend," I almost said no. I almost ran back into my shell. But then I remembered the feeling of that bookstore, the smell of old paper, the warmth of the wood shelves, and the way he had looked at me like I was worth understanding. So I said yes. And let me tell you, my friends, that coffee date was not romantic. It was not smooth. It was not anything like the movies, where the couple gazes into each other's eyes and says perfect things. No, our first real meeting outside the bookstore was a beautiful disaster of mispronounced words, awkward silences, and a small boy who didn't want to be there. But in that mess, in all that imperfection, I discovered something that would change the way I thought about love, language, and learning forever. Let me paint you the scene, a tiny coffee shop on the corner of a street I couldn't pronounce. The December air was biting cold, and I had worn the only coat I owned, a thin thing that was never meant for American winters. I was early, because I'm always early when I'm nervous. I sat at a table by the window, rehearsing phrases in my head like a student before an exam. Hello, good to see you. How was your day? Thank you for coming. Simple, basic. But in my head, these words were like trying to solve a puzzle while someone kept moving the pieces. I could feel my heart racing, my palms sweating, and that familiar knot of anxiety forming in my stomach. And you know what I realized while I was sitting there? This fear I was feeling, it wasn't just about Michael. It was about my entire existence in this country. It was about every time I had been misunderstood, every time someone had looked at me with pity or confusion, every time I had opened my mouth and felt like a child pretending to be an adult. Then the door opened, and he walked in with Leo. Michael was wearing a simple brown coat, and he was carrying Leo on his shoulders like a king carrying his prince. Leo was laughing, his little face red from the cold, and he was pointing at something outside. When they saw me, both of them smiled, the same smile, like two versions of the same painting. Michael put Leo down and walked over to me. "Mai," he said, and just hearing my name in his voice made me feel like I was coming home. "You came." And I said, "I came." 2 words. That was all I could manage. But they were the truest words I had said all week. Because coming to that coffee shop, despite every fear in my body, was an act of bravery I didn't know I had. Now here's where it gets interesting. Leo was not happy to be there. He was 6 years old, full of energy and completely uninterested in watching 2 adults drink coffee and stumble through small talk. He squirmed in his seat, kicked his legs, and made little sounds of boredom. Michael tried to calm him down, but I could see the exhaustion in his eyes. And in that moment, I had a choice. I could pretend that everything was normal, ignore Leo's restlessness, and try to have the perfect date that I had imagined. Or I could be real. I could do something that had nothing to do with being romantic and everything to do with being human. So I looked at Leo, and in my broken English, I said, "Do you like stories?" He stopped squirming and looked at me with those curious eyes, the same eyes I had seen in the bookstore. "Yes," he said, "I like superheroes." I smiled and said, "I don't know superheroes in English, but I know a story in Vietnamese. I can tell you if you teach me one superhero word." And Leo tilted his head, completely confused but also completely interested.
"Okay," he said. "Hulk."
"Hulk," I repeated. "That is a good word. Now my turn. In my language, courage is dung cam." Leo repeated it, his small tongue twisting around the unfamiliar sounds, and we both laughed. Now, you might think this is just a cute story about a child and a stranger, but for me, it was a revelation. Because in that moment, I stopped trying to be the perfect girlfriend, the perfect English speaker, the perfect version of myself. I just showed up as a real person, someone who made mistakes, someone who was learning, someone who had something to offer in the only way she knew how. And you know what happened? Michael relaxed too. He stopped trying to make the date work and just let it happen. He let me be awkward. He let Leo be a child. He let the whole experience be exactly what it was. Imperfect, messy, and absolutely wonderful. The science of this is actually fascinating. When we meet new people, especially in a language that's not our first, our brains go into what psychologists call hyperawareness. We become overly conscious of every word, every gesture, every expression. This hyperawareness drains our cognitive resources, leaving us less energy to actually process the conversation. It's like trying to drive a car while constantly checking the rearview mirror, the speedometer, and the gas gauge. You can do it, but you can't really focus on the road. But when I stopped worrying about how I sounded and started focusing on connecting with Leo and Michael, something shifted. My brain relaxed. The words came a little easier. The anxiety quieted down. And for the first time in months, I didn't feel like a foreigner. I just felt like someone having coffee. And that's the secret, isn't it? Language learning, dating, building a new life. None of these things are about perfection. They're about presence. They're about showing up and trusting that whatever happens, you'll figure it out as you go. I remember reading a study about language acquisition that said people who focus on fluent communication rather than perfect accuracy actually learn faster. The researchers called it the communication-first approach. And they found that when learners prioritize getting their message across over using perfect grammar, their brains are more receptive to new information because they're not constantly in fight or flight mode. So here's my unsolicited advice to you, my friend. Next time you're afraid to speak, focus on one thing. Am I communicating my message? Not, am I saying this correctly? Not, will they judge me? Just, am I making myself understood? And if the answer is yes, you've already won. Back to the coffee shop. We spent 2 hours talking about simple things. The weather, the book I was reading, Leo's favorite superheroes, Michael's job as a graphic designer. I told him about Vietnam, about the food, the heat, the way the streets would come alive at night. He listened like every word was precious, like my accent wasn't a barrier, but a melody. And in return, he told me about his wife, who had passed away 3 years ago from a sudden illness. He told me about the grief, the loneliness, the challenge of raising Leo alone. And I realized that we were both carrying heavy things. We were both learning how to be okay again. And somewhere between the second cup of coffee and Leo drawing pictures on a napkin, I felt a shift inside me. This wasn't just a date. This was the beginning of something real. But here's the thing about beginnings. They're fragile. They need care. They need patience. They need the willingness to show up even when you're scared. And after that coffee shop, I was still scared. I was scared of getting attached, scared of being hurt again, scared of being the foreigner who didn't belong. But I was also more scared of losing this chance. So when Michael said, "Can we do this again next week?" I didn't hesitate. I said, "Yes. I will bring a story for Leo." And Michael laughed, a deep, warm laugh that felt like sunshine breaking through the winter clouds. I walked home that day feeling lighter than I had in months. The streets were still cold, the buildings were still gray, and my English was still broken. But I felt like I had discovered something profound, that people don't fall in love with perfect grammar. They fall in love with courage, with honesty, with the small moments of connection that transcend language. They fall in love with someone who tries, who stays, who says, "I don't know all the words, but I know what I feel." In the next section, I'll share with you the cultural challenges that came next, the unexpected conflicts, the differences in how we saw the world, and the moment I realized that love doesn't erase difference. It simply learns to honor it. But for now, I want you to take a deep breath. Wherever you are in your language learning journey, give yourself credit for trying. Give yourself permission to be imperfect. Because, my friend, the only way to lose is to stop showing up. And you right now are showing up. And that's a beautiful thing. The first broken sentences. You know that feeling when you're about to say something important and your mouth opens, but your brain suddenly forgets every word you've ever known? That was me on our second date, and our third, and our fourth. Every time I tried to speak English with Michael, I felt like a bird trapped in a cage made of grammar rules and verb tenses. But here's the thing about falling in love with someone who speaks a different language. It forces you to become creative. You can't rely on fancy vocabulary or clever jokes. You have to use the simplest words, the most basic sentences, and somehow, those simple words start to mean more than you ever imagined. Our love story wasn't built on poetry or grand gestures. It was built on broken sentences, misunderstood words, and the kind of patience that comes from really wanting to understand another person. And let me tell you, my friends, those broken sentences taught me more about love than any perfect paragraph ever could. Let me give you an example of what I mean. About 3 weeks after that first coffee shop date, Michael invited me to his house for dinner. Not a fancy dinner, just spaghetti and meatballs, which he proudly told me was the only thing I can cook without burning. I walked up to his front door, clutching a small gift I had brought from Vietnam, a little wooden statue of a buffalo, which in my culture represents strength and patience. I had practiced what I wanted to say about it all day. This is a buffalo. It means strength. I hope you like it. Simple, right? But when he opened the door and I saw his warm smile, my mind went completely blank. I handed him the gift and said, "This is animal, strong, for you." Not exactly what I had practiced. But he didn't laugh or correct me. He just looked at the statue, turned it over in his hands, and said, "It's beautiful, Mai. Just like you." And I realized that he understood exactly what I meant, not because of my perfect grammar, but because he was listening with his heart. Now, here's where I want to get a little scientific with you, because I think it's important to understand why communication in a new language feels so hard sometimes. When we speak our native language, our brain processes words automatically, almost like breathing. We don't think about grammar or word order. We just produce language effortlessly. But when we speak a second language, our brains have to work much harder. Neuroscientists have found that bilingual speakers actually use different neural pathways for their two languages, and switching between them takes cognitive effort. This is called language interference, and it's why sometimes you'll be speaking English and suddenly a Vietnamese word pops out. Or you'll forget a simple word like fork, even though you know it perfectly well. It's not because you're stupid or not trying hard enough. It's because your brain is doing something incredibly complex, and sometimes it gets tired. Think of it like a computer that's running too many programs at once. It slows down, glitches, and occasionally crashes. That's not a bad computer. That's a computer that's working overtime. The most beautiful thing about those early days with Michael was that he never made me feel like my broken English was a burden. He would slow down his speech. He would ask questions to make sure I understood. He would encourage me when I struggled and celebrate with me when I got a sentence right. He would point at things and say their names. My, that's a spoon. My, that's a window. My, that's a squirrel running across the yard. And I would repeat after him, each repetition bringing me closer to feeling like this language could actually be mine. Children, I discovered, are the best language teachers in the world. They don't care about grammar. They don't correct you constantly. They just want to communicate, to share, to connect. And in their simple, joyful way, they make learning feel less like work and more like play. There was one moment, about a month into our relationship, that I will never forget. We were sitting in Michael's living room, drinking hot chocolate, and Leo was drawing pictures on a piece of paper. I was trying to tell Michael about my life in Vietnam, about the market near my mother's house where I would buy fresh fruit every morning. But I couldn't remember the word for mango. I knew it started with an M, but the word just wouldn't come. I felt my face flushing with frustration. I wanted to give up, to just say never mind and change the subject. But Leo looked up from his drawing and said, "My, is it like a big yellow fruit?" I nodded. "Mango," he shouted. "You mean mango." And then Michael said, "My, look at Leo. He just taught you a word. And now you'll never forget it because you had to work for it." And he was right. I have never forgotten the word mango since that moment. It's not just a word anymore. It's a memory of connection, of kindness, of a little boy who helped me feel less alone. This experience actually aligns perfectly with something linguists call the affective filter hypothesis. It's a theory that says our ability to learn a language is heavily influenced by our emotional state. When we feel anxious, embarrassed, or threatened, our affective filter goes up and we block out new information. But when we feel safe, supported, and motivated, our filter comes down and language can flow in easily. So that night, when Leo helped me with the word mango, and Michael smiled at me with so much patience, my affective filter was practically on the floor. I was absorbing new words without even realizing it. I was learning not because I was studying, but because I was living. The other thing I discovered during this time is that broken English can sometimes be more honest than perfect English. When you don't have the vocabulary to be diplomatic or to hide your true feelings, you have to be straightforward. You have to say exactly what you mean, even if it comes out a little clumsy. I remember one night I was feeling particularly homesick. I miss my mother's voice. I miss the sound of Vietnamese music. I missed the way the air smelled in the rainy season. And I didn't have the words to explain all of this complex emotion. So I just said, "Michael, I miss my country." And he looked at me with such understanding and he said, "I know, I miss my wife. Missing is not a language. Missing is a feeling." And in that moment, we connected on a level that had nothing to do with grammar or vocabulary. We connected on the level of two human beings who had both known loss, both known longing, and both understood the weight of carrying a broken heart while trying to build something new. It was also during this time that I started to realize how much of language learning is actually about culture. In Vietnam, we have many ways to say, "I love you," without using the actual words. We show love through food, through care, through small acts of service. But in America, people say, "I love you" very directly, sometimes even to strangers. This was confusing to me at first. When Michael said, "I love you" after only 3 months, I panicked. I thought, this is too fast. Is this a trick? What does he really want? But then I realized that in his culture, saying I love you was not a binding contract. It was an expression of feeling, as natural as saying good morning. It took me a long time to understand this, and even longer to feel comfortable saying it back. But when I finally did, I said it in English. And it felt like I had learned a new word for the color of the sky, a word that didn't exist in my own language, but made perfect sense in this new one. I also learned that humor in a new language is a powerful thing. When you can laugh at your own mistakes, you stop being so afraid of making them. One time I was trying to say, I want to go to the supermarket, but instead I accidentally said, I want to go to the superstar. Michael looked at me with wide eyes and said, are you secretly famous? We both burst out laughing. And in that laughter, I felt something shift inside me. The fear was gone. The pressure was gone. All that was left was two people sharing a moment of pure, simple joy. And isn't that what language is really for? Not to impress people, not to prove how smart you are, but to connect, to laugh, to share the small, beautiful moments of being alive. The most beautiful part of this journey was watching Leo start to accept me. At first, he was cautious, like a small animal deciding whether a stranger is safe. But slowly, through our shared moments of language learning, he started to see me as a friend, then as a playmate, and finally as something more. One evening, we were reading a book together, a simple children's book about a dog who goes on an adventure. I was sounding out the words, and Leo was helping me with the difficult ones. And when we finished the book, he looked at me and said, you're getting better. Your English is starting to sound like me. And I thought, if a 6-year-old sees progress in me, then there is hope for all of us. So here's what I want you to take away from this section of my story. Learning a language is not about being perfect. It's about being present. It's about showing up with your broken sentences and your mispronounced words and your determination to be heard anyway. It's about finding people who will listen with patience and answer with kindness. And it's about realizing that every mistake you make is actually a step forward, a crack in the wall between you and the person you're trying to reach. In the next section, I'll tell you about the cultural differences that almost tore us apart, the arguments, the misunderstandings, and the moment I thought everything was going to fall apart. Because love, like language, is not always smooth sailing. Sometimes the waves are rough and you have to hold on tight. But if you hold on and you keep trying, you might just find yourself on the other side, stronger than you ever imagined. The cultural maze. You know that feeling when you think you're doing everything right, but somehow everything still goes wrong? That was me during my first American Christmas. I had been dating Michael for about 4 months, and I thought I understood American culture. I had watched enough movies. I had read enough books. I had practiced my English every single day. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for the cultural maze I was about to walk through. It started with something as simple as breakfast. One morning, Michael made me a bowl of cereal with cold milk, and I stared at it like it was an alien artifact. In Vietnam, breakfast is hot soup, or rice with meat, or noodles and broth. Cold cereal? That's something you eat as a snack, not as the first meal of the day. But I didn't want to seem ungrateful, so I ate it and I smiled and I said, "Thank you, very good." And Michael smiled back, completely unaware that inside, I was thinking, why is this country so strange? That was the beginning of what I now call my cultural maze period, a time when every small difference felt like a giant wall, and every misunderstanding felt like a personal failure. Let me be completely honest with you. Culture shock is not just about missing your own food or your own language. It's about the slow, creeping realization that the way you see the world is not the only way. It's about discovering that your deepest values, things you thought were universal, are actually specific to your culture. Take Christmas, for example. In Vietnam, we celebrate it too, but it's more of a romantic holiday for young couples, like Valentine's Day with a Christmas tree. We don't have big family dinners. We don't have the tradition of giving elaborate gifts. We don't have the expectation that everyone will gather together and pretend to be happy even when they're not. So when Michael's family invited me to their Christmas dinner, I had no idea what I was walking into. There were 20 people in that house. Aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents, all talking at once, all laughing, all speaking English so fast that my brain felt like it was trying to drink from a fire hose. I sat in the corner, nodding and smiling, understanding maybe 10% of what was being said. And when Michael's aunt handed me a beautifully wrapped gift, I panicked. I had brought a small box of Vietnamese tea, but it suddenly felt like nothing compared to the elaborate presents being exchanged around me. And here's where the cultural maze got really confusing. In America, when you receive a gift, you open it immediately, in front of everyone, and you react with enthusiasm. In Vietnam, you open gifts privately, to avoid seeming greedy. So when I received that gift and just smiled and said, "Thank you," without opening it, Michael's aunt looked hurt. She said, "Aren't you going to open it, dear?" I felt my face turn red. I opened it quickly. It was a beautiful scarf, and I said, "It's lovely," but I could tell that my reaction was not dramatic enough. I had failed some unspoken cultural test, and I didn't even know I was being tested. Later, Michael explained to me, in American culture, we show excitement when we get gifts. It's a way of honoring the giver. And I thought, in my culture, we show restraint. It's a way of honoring the giver too. Two different ways of expressing the same feeling, and somehow, both of us were right and both of us were wrong at the same time. The science behind cultural differences is actually fascinating. Psychologists have identified something called cultural dimensions, which are the underlying values that shape how people from different societies think and behave. One major dimension is individualism versus collectivism. America, like most Western countries, leans heavily toward individualism. People here value independence, personal achievement, and direct communication. Vietnam, like most Asian countries, leans toward collectivism, where the group's needs come before the individual's. And indirect communication is often preferred to maintain harmony. So when I was at that Christmas dinner and everyone was praising each other directly and talking about their accomplishments, I felt uncomfortable. In my culture, you don't talk about your own achievements, you let others talk about them for you. But in Michael's family, if you didn't mention your successes, people assumed you had none. It was a fundamental misunderstanding of values, and it left me feeling like a complete outsider. Another huge cultural difference I struggled with was the American attitude toward time. In Vietnam, time is fluid. If you say you'll meet someone at 2 p.m., they might arrive at 2:30 or 3 p.m., and nobody gets upset. But in America, being late is considered rude, even disrespectful. I learned this lesson the hard way when I showed up 15 minutes late to a dinner with Michael's boss. I had taken the bus and the bus had been delayed, and I figured it was no big deal. But when I arrived, Michael was stressed and his boss looked annoyed. I apologized, but my apology didn't seem to help. Later, Michael explained, in American business culture, punctuality is a sign of respect. And I thought, in Vietnamese culture, if you're on time, it might mean you didn't care enough to prepare properly. Again, two different worlds, two different rules, and I was trying to navigate both of them with a vocabulary of about 500 words. But here's the thing about cultural differences, they're not good or bad. They're just different. And the key to navigating them is not to judge, but to learn. I remember reading a study about cultural intelligence, which is the ability to adapt to and function effectively in culturally diverse situations. The researchers found that people with high cultural intelligence don't necessarily know all the rules of every culture. Instead, they're good at observing, asking questions, and adjusting their behavior based on feedback. So I started treating every cultural difference as a puzzle to solve rather than a wall to hit. When I didn't understand something, I would ask Michael, "Is this normal in America? Or is this just your family?" And he would laugh and explain. When I made a mistake, I would apologize and try to understand what I could do differently next time. And slowly, over time, the maze started to make sense. One of the most surprising cultural differences I encountered was the American way of expressing love. In Vietnam, we don't say, "I love you" very often. We show love through actions, cooking, caring, sacrificing. But in America, Michael said, "I love you" to me almost every day, and sometimes several times a day. At first, it made me uncomfortable. I thought, how can you say that so easily? How can you know that so soon? But then I realized that for him, saying "I love you" was not a grand proclamation of eternal commitment. It was an everyday affirmation of affection, as natural as saying, "Good morning." This was a huge adjustment for me, and I'll be honest, it took me almost a year before I could say it back without feeling like I was lying. But when I finally did say it, and I said it in English, and I said it from my heart, it was one of the most liberating moments of my life. I had learned a new way to express love, not better, not worse, just different. The cultural maze also affected my relationship with Leo. In Vietnam, children are expected to be obedient and quiet. In America, children are encouraged to express themselves, to question things, and to have opinions. When Leo would argue with Michael about bedtime or vegetables, I would feel uncomfortable. I would think, why is he being so disrespectful? But then I realized that in American culture, this is not disrespect. It's a sign that the child is confident and independent. And when Leo would ask me direct questions about my past, my marriage, why I came to America, questions that would be considered rude in Vietnamese culture, I had to remind myself that he was not being nosy. He was being curious. He was trying to understand me in the only way he knew how. The most painful part of the cultural maze was the feeling of never quite fitting in. Even when I learned the rules, even when I adapted my behavior, I still felt like I was wearing someone else's clothes. I would speak English with the correct grammar, but my accent would give me away. I would follow American customs, but my instincts would still be Vietnamese. I would laugh at American jokes, but sometimes I would laugh a second too late after I had mentally translated the punchline. And in those moments, I would feel so tired of trying, so tired of being the foreigner who never quite belonged. But then something shifted. One night, after a particularly exhausting family dinner, Michael and I were sitting on his porch, watching the stars. I was quiet, and he could tell something was wrong. He said, "What's going on?" And I tried to explain in my broken English the feeling of being caught between two worlds. "I am not American," I said. "I am not Vietnamese anymore. I am nothing." And Michael took my hand and he said, "You are not nothing. You are a bridge. You are someone who knows two worlds and connects them. And that is a beautiful thing to be." That moment changed everything for me. I realized that I didn't have to choose between being Vietnamese and being American. I could be both. I could create my own culture, my own identity, made from the pieces of both worlds that I loved. And that identity, that blended identity, was not a weakness. It was a superpower. So here's what I want you to understand, especially if you're learning English in a new country. Culture shock is real, and it's painful, but it's also temporary. The maze feels confusing because you're still learning the map. But every wrong turn, every misunderstanding, every awkward moment is actually a step toward understanding. The science tells us that our brains are remarkably adaptable. They can learn new patterns, new values, new ways of interacting with the world. It takes time, yes. It takes patience, absolutely. But the human brain is wired for learning, for growth, and for adaptation. And every day you spend in that maze is a day you're building a new set of neural pathways, a new way of seeing the world, a new version of yourself. In the next section, I'll share with you the moment everything nearly fell apart, when the differences between us seemed too big to bridge. And I thought I would have to walk away. Because the cultural maze doesn't end with understanding, it ends with acceptance. And acceptance, my friends, is a whole other kind of journey. The honest scars. Have you ever told someone the one secret you thought would make them run away, and then they just stayed? That's what happened on a rainy Tuesday night in April, when I finally decided to tell Michael the whole truth about my past. Not the edited version I had been giving him, the polished story where I was a brave woman who left her country to start a new life. I'm talking about the raw, ugly, unedited truth. The part where I wasn't brave at all. The part where I was actually running away from the biggest failure of my life. I had been carrying this secret like a stone in my chest for 4 months, and every time Michael said something sweet, every time Leo laughed at my accent, every time I felt myself falling deeper into this new life, the stone got heavier. Because I knew that if they really knew who I was, if they knew the whole story, they might not want me anymore. And that fear, my friends, was slowly eating me alive. Let me take you back to the night I decided to tell him. We were sitting on his couch, watching some American movie that I couldn't fully follow, and Leo was asleep in his room. The rain was tapping against the windows, and the whole world felt quiet and safe. Michael had his arm around me, and I felt so comfortable, so at home, that I almost forgot why I was so scared. But then he said something that cracked me open. He said, I've been thinking about our future. I want you to know that I see a future with you. A real future. And instead of feeling happy, I felt terrified. Because a future with him meant eventually telling him the truth. The truth about my marriage. The truth about why I left Vietnam. The truth about the promise I made to myself that I thought I had buried forever. So I took a deep breath and I said, Michael, I need to tell you something. It's not good. You might not want me after you hear it. He looked at me with those kind eyes, the ones that had seen so much pain and chosen to stay soft, and he said, you can tell me anything. I promise I won't leave. And I wanted to believe him, but I had heard promises before. I had heard them from a man who promised to love me forever and then told me I was worthless. I had heard them from a man who promised we would have children and then blamed me when we couldn't. So I was scared, but I was also tired. Tired of carrying the stone. Tired of pretending. Tired of being half-seen. And so I told him. In my broken English, with tears streaming down my face, I told him about my ex-husband. I told him about the 5 years of marriage that started with so much hope and ended with so much pain. I told him about the pregnancy tests that always came back negative, the doctors who said they couldn't find anything wrong, and the cruel words my husband would throw at me when the disappointment became too much. You're not a real woman, he would say. What good are you if you can't give me children? And I would cry and apologize and try harder, even though there was nothing left to try. I told Michael about the night I finally left, how I packed one suitcase while my husband was at work, how I sat on the floor of my empty apartment and stared at the wedding photos, how I realized that I would rather be alone for the rest of my life than spend one more minute being told I wasn't enough. I came to America, I said, my voice barely a whisper, because I wanted to disappear. I wanted to become someone new. Someone who wasn't broken.
But I'm still the same Mai.
I still can't have children. I'm still not enough. And then I waited. I waited for him to pull away. I waited for him to look at me with pity, or worse, with disappointment. I waited for him to say something like, I need time to think, or this is a lot to process, or maybe we should slow down. But he didn't say any of those things. He just held me tighter and he said, Mai, I don't love you because of what you can give me. I love you because of who you are. You came to a new country with nothing. You learned a new language. You opened your heart to a widower and his son. You are not broken. You are one of the strongest people I know. And I cried even harder because nobody had ever said that to me before. Nobody had ever seen my scars and called them beautiful. Now, I want to pause here and talk about the science of honesty, because this moment taught me something profound about how trust is built. Psychologists have studied what they call self-disclosure, which is the process of revealing personal information to another person. They've found that self-disclosure is one of the most powerful ways to build intimacy and trust in a relationship. When we share something vulnerable about ourselves and the other person responds with acceptance rather than judgment, it creates what researchers call a trust loop. Our brain releases oxytocin, sometimes called the bonding hormone, which makes us feel closer to that person. And the more we share, the more we trust, and the more we trust, the more we want to share. It's a beautiful upward spiral of connection. But here's the catch. For self-disclosure to work, it has to be reciprocal. You can't just dump all your painful secrets on someone and expect them to stay. You have to be willing to listen to their secrets too. And that night, after I had finished crying and Michael had held me for what felt like hours, he started to talk. He told me about the night his wife died. He told me about the guilt he carried, the feeling that he should have done more, the fear that he would never be able to love someone again. He told me that he had been living in a fog for 3 years, just going through the motions, until he met a woman in a bookstore who couldn't speak English properly, but had the bravest smile he had ever seen. We stayed up until 3 a.m. just talking, and I realized that we were both broken. We were both carrying heavy things. But somehow, when we put our broken pieces together, they started to form something whole. It wasn't about fixing each other. It was about sharing each other's weight. And that night, I learned that the opposite of brokenness is not perfection. The opposite of brokenness is connection. It's knowing that you're not alone. It's knowing that someone else has seen your ugliest parts and still chooses to stay. The next morning, I woke up on his couch, wrapped in a blanket, and the first thing I saw was Leo standing over me with a bowl of cereal. Mai, he said, Daddy said you were sad last night, so I made you breakfast. It was the same cold cereal I had struggled with months ago, but this time, it felt like the most precious gift in the world. I sat up, hugged him, and said, Thank you, Leo. You are a good boy. And he said, Mai, I know you can't have babies. Daddy told me. But that's okay, because you can still be my friend. Out of the mouth of a 6-year-old came the most profound truth, that family is not about biology. Family is about love. Family is about showing up. Family is about being there for each other, even when it's hard. That night changed everything for me. I stopped trying to be the perfect woman, the perfect girlfriend, the perfect English speaker. I started just being myself, a woman who had made mistakes, who had been hurt, who had hurt others, who was learning and growing and trying her best. And you know what? The world didn't end. Michael didn't leave. Leo still wanted to be my friend. The sky didn't fall. The ground didn't open up and swallow me. The only thing that happened was that I felt lighter. The stone was gone. And in its place was a kind of peace I had never known before. Here's what I want you to understand, especially if you're carrying your own heavy secrets. Honesty is terrifying, but it's also freeing. The people who are meant to stay in your life will not run away from your truth. They might be shocked. They might need time to process. But if they truly love you, they will stay. And if they run, then they were never meant to stay in the first place. This is true in love, and it's true in language learning. When you're honest about your struggles, when you say, I don't understand, or please speak slower, or I'm trying my best, you give other people permission to be honest with you too. You create a space where everyone can be imperfect together. And that space, my friends, is where real growth happens. The science backs this up too. Researchers have found that students who adopt a growth mindset, the belief that their abilities can be developed through effort, learn more effectively than students who believe their abilities are fixed. When you're honest about your challenges, you're actually adopting a growth mindset. You're saying, I'm not good at this yet, but I'm working on it. And that yet is the most powerful word in the language. Not I can't, but I can't yet. Not I don't know, but I don't know yet. Because with time, with practice, with patience, you will get there. And when you get there, you'll look back at this moment and be so proud of how far you've come. In the next section, I'll tell you about the hardest test of our relationship, the moment when Leo's mother's memory seemed to stand between us. And I had to learn what it really means to love someone who already loves someone else. Because love is not always about being first. Sometimes it's about being willing to be second, third, or even fourth, and still choosing to stay. The boy's tears. You know that feeling when you think everything is finally going right, and then life decides to remind you that it has a very different plan? That's exactly what happened 3 days after I told Michael my deepest secret. I had finally started to believe that maybe, just maybe, I could have a future with this man and his son. I had started to imagine a life where I wasn't running away from my past, but walking towards something beautiful. And then, on a sunny Saturday afternoon, Leo said something that shattered me into a million pieces. It wasn't meant to be cruel. It wasn't even meant to be hurtful. It was just honest, the brutal, unfiltered honesty of a 6-year-old who is trying to make sense of a world that had already broken his heart once. We were in the backyard playing catch with a red rubber ball, and Leo was laughing that beautiful laugh that made everything feel right in the world. And then, out of nowhere, he stopped running, looked at me with those big brown eyes, and said, why can't my real mom come back? You miss her. I want her to read me bedtime stories, not you. The ball fell from my hands, and I felt something inside me crack open. Not because I was angry at him. I could never be angry at a child who was grieving. But because I realized in that moment that no matter how much I loved Michael and Leo, I would always be standing in the shadow of someone I could never replace. I didn't know what to say. My English, which had been improving so much, completely failed me. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. I just stood there, frozen, while Leo looked at me with confusion and sadness. He didn't understand why his words had hurt me. He was just a little boy who missed his mother, and I was the stranger who had wandered into his life and started taking her place. Michael came running out of the house when he heard the silence, and he saw the two of us standing there, me with tears in my eyes. Leo with his small shoulders hunched in confusion. He knelt down next to his son and said, "Leo, what did you say?" And Leo, in his innocent voice, repeated, "I just said I miss Mommy. I asked why she can't come back." Michael looked at me, and I could see the pain in his eyes, not just for his son, but for me. He had to choose in that moment, comfort his grieving child or comfort the woman he loved. It was an impossible choice, and I knew it. So I did the only thing I could think of. I said, "It's okay, Michael. I'll go home. You talk to Leo." And I walked away, my heart pounding in my chest, my hands shaking, and my eyes burning with tears that I refused to let fall until I was safely inside my tiny apartment. That night, I sat alone in my room, staring at the ceiling, and I asked myself the question that had been haunting me since the very beginning. Mai, what are you doing? What makes you think you can be a mother to a child who already has a mother, even if she's gone? What makes you think you can fill a space that was never meant for you? I didn't have any answers. All I had was the memory of Leo's face, confused and sad, and the sound of his voice saying, "I want her to read me bedtime stories, not you." It felt like someone had reached inside my chest and squeezed my heart until it stopped beating. I thought about all the years I had spent trying to have my own children, all the pain, all the doctors, all the cruel words from my ex-husband. And now, when I had finally found a family that could have been mine, I was being reminded that I would never really belong. I was just a substitute, a placeholder, someone who was there until the real thing came back, even though the real thing could never come back. But here's where the story gets interesting. The next morning, I woke up with a different feeling. Not anger, not sadness, but something more complicated. It was empathy. I started thinking about Leo, really thinking about him, not as a child who had hurt me, but as a little person who was carrying a grief that no 6-year-old should have to carry. I thought about my own mother back in Vietnam, how she had been my anchor, my safe place, my everything. And I imagined what it would be like to suddenly lose her, to wake up one morning and know that she was never coming back. The thought made me feel physically sick. And then I thought about Michael, the man I loved, who had to watch his son grieve while trying to grieve himself, while also trying to build a new life with a woman who couldn't speak the language perfectly. The weight of it all was almost unbearable. That's when I decided to look up something that changed my perspective completely. I read about the psychology of grief in children, and I discovered something called continuing bonds theory. This theory, developed by psychologists, suggests that instead of expecting children to move on from the death of a loved one, we should help them maintain a connection to that person in a way that allows them to also form new attachments. Basically, it's not about replacing the person who died. It's about adding new relationships to the ones that already exist. Leo didn't need me to be his mother. He needed me to be another person who loved him. He needed to know that loving me didn't mean forgetting his mother. He needed to know that his mother was still a part of his life, even if she wasn't there physically. And I realized that I had been doing it all wrong. I had been trying to compete with a ghost, and that was a battle I could never win. Instead, I needed to learn to honor that ghost, to make space for her memory, and to show Leo that loving me didn't mean betraying her. So I decided to try something new. A few days later, I went back to Michael's house, and I brought a picture with me, an old photo of my own mother and me, taken when I was about Leo's age. I also brought a notebook and some crayons. I found Leo in his room, drawing at his little desk, and I sat down next to him. I said, "Leo, can I show you something?" He looked up a little suspicious and nodded. I showed him the picture of my mother and me. "This is my mom," I said. "She lives very far away. I miss her every day." Leo looked at the picture and said, "You miss your mom?" I nodded. "Yes, I miss her very much. But I still love her, and I know she loves me. And I also love you, Leo. Even though I'm not your mom, I love you." He was quiet for a moment, and then he picked up a crayon and started drawing. "I can draw my mommy," he said. "And you can draw your mommy. And we can put them together." So we did. We drew pictures of our mothers and we put them next to each other on the wall, and for the first time, I saw Leo smile at me without any sadness in his eyes. That was the moment everything changed. Not because I had replaced his mother, but because I had acknowledged her. I had given him permission to love both of us, without guilt, without confusion. And in doing so, I had finally found my place in his heart. It wasn't the place of a mother. It was the place of someone who loved him without trying to take anything away from the mother he had lost. Now, I want to talk about the science behind this because it's genuinely fascinating. Researchers who study replacement theory versus attachment theory have found that children who are encouraged to form new attachments while maintaining bonds with lost loved ones tend to have better emotional outcomes than children who are told to move on or forget. There's a concept called emotional memory integration, which is the process of making new emotional experiences fit with old ones. When I created a space for Leo to talk about his mother, when I showed him that I wasn't threatened by her memory, I was helping him integrate his love for his mother with his growing affection for me. Instead of creating a conflict, I created a bridge. And that bridge made all the difference in the world. This experience taught me that love is not a finite resource. It's not like a pie that gets smaller when you share it. Love is infinite. It can grow and expand and make room for everyone. Leo could love his mother and love me at the same time. Michael could love his first wife and love me at the same time. And I could love my own mother back in Vietnam and love this new family at the same time. There was no competition. There was only more love. In the weeks that followed, something beautiful happened. Leo started to include me in his stories about his mother. He would say things like, "My mommy used to make pancakes like this, but yours are different, Mai." And I would say, "Tell me more about her pancakes. I want to learn how to make them just like she did." And he would smile and tell me, and we would try to recreate her recipes together. In that process, I wasn't replacing his mother. I was honoring her. I was learning from her, even though she was gone. And in a strange way, I felt connected to her too, this woman I had never met, who had created this beautiful little boy that I was now lucky enough to love. So here's what I want you to take away from this part of my story. If you're learning English, if you're trying to build a life in a new country, if you're trying to love someone who has a past, remember that you don't have to replace anything. You just have to add. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be present. And most importantly, you don't have to erase someone else's story to write your own. You can find your place alongside theirs. You can build bridges, not walls. And when you do, you might find that your heart becomes a house with many rooms, and every room is filled with love. In the next section, I'll tell you about the small, daily actions that helped me truly become part of this family, not through grand gestures, but through simple, consistent acts of love. Because sometimes, the most powerful changes happen in the quietest moments. The daily practice. You know those moments in life that don't feel important when they're happening, but years later you look back and realize they were everything? That's what the next few months felt like, a series of small, unremarkable moments that slowly, quietly, built something extraordinary. After the breakthrough with Leo, I didn't try to be a hero. I didn't plan grand gestures or dramatic declarations of love. I just showed up. Every single day. I showed up to Michael's house after work, even when I was tired. I showed up with my broken English and my imperfect understanding of American culture. I showed up to cook dinner, even though I was still learning the difference between a teaspoon and a tablespoon. I showed up to read bedtime stories to Leo, even though I stumbled over every third word. And somewhere in the middle of all that showing up, something shifted. I stopped being the foreign girlfriend who was trying to fit in. I started becoming part of the family, not through any single dramatic event, but through the slow, steady accumulation of love that happens when you choose to be present, day after day, without expecting anything in return. Let me give you an example of what I mean. Every evening, after dinner, I would sit on the floor of Leo's room with a children's book in my hands. Now, you have to understand, reading aloud in English was one of the hardest things for me. In Vietnamese, I could read with emotion and expression. I could change my voice for different characters. I could make the story come alive. But in English, I was so focused on pronouncing each word correctly that I sounded like a robot. I read in this flat, monotone voice that would have put anyone to sleep. But Leo didn't care.
And it worked.
The science of this is actually quite beautiful. Researchers have found that language learning is heavily dependent on something called spaced repetition. This means that our brains learn better when we encounter new information over time, with breaks in between, rather than trying to cram it all in at once. Every night I read to Leo, I was exposing myself to new vocabulary in a low-stress environment. I wasn't being tested. I wasn't being judged. I was just reading and enjoying and learning without even realizing it. And because I was doing it consistently, my brain was making new connections, strengthening neural pathways, and slowly building the framework I needed to become fluent. It's like planting a garden. You don't see the growth overnight, but if you water it every day, eventually you look out the window and realize it's blooming. Another daily practice that changed everything was cooking. Now, I'm not a great cook, I never have been, but I knew how to make simple Vietnamese dishes that Michael and Leo had never tried before. So, I started teaching them how to make pho. Not the complicated, hours-long version, but a simple, quick version that tasted like home. The first time I tried to explain the recipe in English, it was a disaster. Put water in pot.
Heat.
Then put, the white things.
The.
Noodles. And the meat.
Wait.
Not the meat yet.
After.
I mean before. Actually, Michael just laughed and said, let's just cook together and you can show me. So we did. And cooking became our language lesson without words. I would point to the ingredients, and Michael would say their names in English. I would repeat them, trying to mimic his pronunciation. Leo would join in, holding up different spices and shouting their names. And by the time the pho was ready, we had learned a dozen new words without even trying. There's a reason why cooking is such a powerful language learning tool. It's multisensory. You're seeing the ingredients, hearing the names, touching the textures, smelling the aromas, and tasting the flavors. All of those sensory inputs help anchor the vocabulary in your brain, making it easier to remember. And the best part? At the end, you get to eat. But the daily practice that meant the most to me wasn't about learning words at all. It was about learning to be present. You see, before I met Michael, I was always waiting for the other shoe to drop. I was always bracing myself for disappointment, waiting for someone to leave, waiting for everything to fall apart. My ex-husband had taught me that love was conditional, that it could be taken away at any moment, that I had to constantly prove my worth to keep it. So I lived in a state of hypervigilance, always looking for signs that I was about to be rejected again. But living with Michael and Leo forced me to slow down. There were no hidden tests. There were no games. Every day was just life. Ordinary, beautiful life. Leo would come home from school and tell me about his day, and I would listen, even if I didn't understand every word. Michael would come home from work and kiss my forehead, and I would feel my heart flutter, even though we had been together for months. We would eat dinner together, watch TV together, do the dishes together. Nothing special, just being together. And slowly, day by day, I started to realize that this was what love really looked like. Not grand gestures or dramatic declarations. Just showing up, consistently, with your whole heart. I remember one evening, about 6 months into our relationship, I was washing the dishes and Michael came up behind me and wrapped his arms around my waist.
He didn't say anything.
He just held me while the water ran and the soap bubbled. And in that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not excitement, Not anxiety, not fear, but a deep, quiet peace. I wasn't thinking about the future. I wasn't thinking about the past. I was just there, in that moment, feeling loved and safe. And I realized that this was what I had been searching for all along. Not a perfect relationship, not a perfect life, but a space where I could just be myself, without pretending, without performing, without being afraid. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. This sounds nice, but learning English takes more than just reading bedtime stories and cooking dinner. And you're absolutely right. I did other things too. I joined a local community class for adult English learners. I watched American TV shows with the subtitles on. I practiced with flashcards on the bus. But the reason I'm focusing on the small, daily moments is because they were the foundation of everything else. The community class gave me grammar rules, but the bedtime stories gave me confidence. The TV shows gave me listening practice, but the dinners gave me context. The flashcards gave me vocabulary, but the conversations with Michael and Leo gave me the courage to actually use it. It was the combination of formal learning and informal practice that made the difference. It was the marriage of structure and spontaneity, of studying and living, of trying and failing and trying again. There's a concept in psychology called habit stacking, which is the idea of attaching a new habit to an existing one. For example, if you already brush your teeth every morning, you can stack a new habit, like practicing English, right before or after that routine. I unconsciously did this with my daily life. Every morning, I would listen to an English podcast while making coffee. Every afternoon, I would write down 3 new words I had heard during the day. Every night, I would read to Leo. These small habits didn't take a lot of time or effort, but because I did them consistently, they added up to massive progress over time. My English didn't improve because I had one amazing day of studying. It improved because I had hundreds of ordinary days of showing up. The most beautiful thing about this period of my life was watching Leo transform as well. When I first met him, he was a quiet, guarded little boy who had lost his mother and was still trying to figure out how to trust. But as the months passed, he started to open up. He would run to me when I arrived at the house. He would save me a seat at dinner. He would tell me his secrets, the small, private thoughts that he only shared with people he truly trusted. And every time he did, I felt my heart swell with a love I hadn't known I was capable of. It wasn't the same as having a biological child. I'll never pretend it was, but it was something just as real, just as powerful. It was the love of a found family, a love that was chosen, a love that was built one small moment at a time. So here's what I want you to take away from this section of my story. Learning a language, building a life, loving a family, none of these things happen overnight. They happen in the small, ordinary moments that don't feel important at the time. They happen when you show up day after day, even when you're tired, even when you're frustrated, even when you feel like you're not making any progress. They happen when you stop waiting for the big breakthrough and start embracing the small steps. They happen when you realize that every single day is a chance to get a little bit better, a little bit stronger, a little bit closer to who you want to be. In the next section, I'll tell you about the letter that changed everything, the simple, imperfect love letter that I wrote to Michael, and how it taught me that sometimes the most powerful words are the ones that come straight from the heart, without any editing or polishing. The simple letter. You know that feeling when you have so much to say, but you don't have the words to say it? That was me on a quiet Sunday afternoon, sitting at Michael's kitchen table with a blank piece of paper in front of me. I had been practicing English for months. I had learned hundreds of new words. I could hold a conversation, order food, even make small talk with strangers. But this was different. This wasn't small talk. This was everything. I wanted to tell Michael how much he meant to me. I wanted to tell him that I had never been this happy, that I had never felt this safe, that I had never loved anyone the way I loved him. But every time I tried to write the words, they felt wrong. Too formal.
Too complicated.
Too much like someone else's words, not my own. So I did something that scared me more than anything. I decided to stop trying to be perfect. I decided to write the letter in the simplest English I knew. I decided to write like a child, because children, I had learned, are the most honest storytellers of all. And what came out of that decision was not a beautiful letter. It was not a poetic letter. It was a letter full of grammar mistakes, misspelled words, and sentences that would make any English teacher cringe. But it was the most honest letter I had ever written. And it changed everything.
Let me share the letter with you, just as I wrote it that day.
I still have it, folded carefully in a drawer, and every time I read it, I remember exactly how I felt when I was writing it. This is what I wrote, in my broken, imperfect English. Dear Michael, I am writing this letter because my English is not good for talking. My heart is full of things I want to say, but my mouth cannot say them. So I write. I am from Vietnam. I came here with one suitcase and a broken heart. I did not think I would find love. I did not think I would find family. But then I met you. You did not laugh at my English. You did not make me feel small. You made me feel like I was enough, even when I could not speak right. And Leo. Dear Leo. He is the best boy I know. He taught me words. He taught me patience. He taught me that love is not about being perfect. Love is about showing up. I know I am not his mother. I know I can never replace her. But I love him like he is my own. I love him with all my heart. And I want to be there for him, every day for the rest of his life. Michael, I am scared. I am scared to write this. I am scared you will read this and think I am foolish. But I have to be honest. I have to tell you the truth. I love you. I love Leo. I want to be your family. I want to be your wife. I want to be Leo's stepmom. But I only want this if you are sure. If you are not sure, I will understand. I will still be grateful for everything. I will still love you both. But I needed you to know the truth. Because hiding my feelings is worse than being rejected. At least this way I tried. At least this way I was honest. That is all.
Meh.
Now I know what you're thinking. That letter is full of mistakes. You used I too many times. Your grammar is all over the place. You didn't even use a proper closing. And you're right. It was not a perfect letter. But it was a true letter. And that, my friends, is what mattered most. Because when I handed that letter to Michael, folded into a little square, my hands shaking, I wasn't trying to impress him with my English. I wasn't trying to prove that I was smart or educated or articulate. I was just trying to tell him the truth. And the truth, in its simplest form, is the most powerful thing in the world. The science behind this is actually fascinating. Researchers who study communication have found that people respond more positively to messages that are perceived as authentic than to messages that are perceived as polished. When we speak or write in our native language, we often edit ourselves, making sure our words are perfect before we share them. But when we speak or write in a second language, we don't have the luxury of editing. We have to say exactly what we mean, even if it comes out clumsy. And there's a strange beauty in that clumsiness. It signals vulnerability. It signals honesty. It signals that we are not trying to hide behind fancy words or clever phrases. We are just being ourselves. I waited for Michael to read the letter. He was sitting on the couch, and I was in the kitchen pretending to wash dishes that were already clean. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure he could hear it from across the room. I watched him unfold the paper, start reading, and then stop. He read it again. And then he looked up at me with tears in his eyes. He walked into the kitchen, took the dish from my hands, and said, "Mai, this is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever given me." I started to apologize for the mistakes, but he stopped me.
"Don't apologize," he said.
"This is you. This is your heart. And I love it. I love you." He held me for a long time, and I cried into his shoulder, not from sadness, but from relief. I had told the truth. I had been completely, utterly myself. And he had not run away. He had come closer. That night, Michael wrote me a letter back. His English was perfect, but he didn't try to show off. He wrote simply, from his heart. He told me that he had been afraid too, afraid of loving again, afraid of trusting again, afraid of introducing a new woman into his son's life. He told me that my broken English made him love me more, not less, because it showed him how hard I was trying, how much I cared, how brave I was to be so vulnerable in a language that wasn't my own. He told me that I had taught him something profound, that love is not about finding someone perfect. Love is about finding someone who is willing to be imperfect with you. And then, at the bottom of the letter, he wrote something that I still read whenever I need encouragement. "Mai, you are not broken. You are not a failure. You are a woman who survived something terrible and still chose to love. That is not weakness. That is the greatest strength I have ever seen. And I would be honored to spend the rest of my life showing you how much you are worth." That letter became the foundation of everything that followed. It wasn't the answer to my proposal. Michael hadn't said yes or no yet. But it was something even more important. It was a promise. A promise that he saw me, truly saw me, and loved what he saw. And that promise gave me the courage to keep going, to keep trying, to keep showing up, even when things got hard. Now, I want to talk about something that might surprise you. Writing that letter, in all its grammatical imperfection, actually helped me become a better English speaker. There's a concept in language learning called output hypothesis, which suggests that producing language, speaking or writing, is essential for language acquisition. When we write, we engage different parts of our brain than when we listen or read. We have to actively retrieve words, construct sentences, and organize our thoughts. This process strengthens our neural connections and makes it easier to recall those words and structures in the future. So even though the letter was full of mistakes, the act of writing it pushed my brain to work harder, to try harder, and in doing so, I was actually teaching myself. It's like exercise. You don't get stronger by thinking about lifting weights. You get stronger by actually doing it. I also learned something important about vulnerability. When I gave Michael that letter, I was taking a huge risk. I was exposing my feelings, my fears, my limitations. I was saying, "This is me, all of me, and I'm trusting you not to hurt me." And when Michael responded with kindness, it created a trust loop that made me want to be even more honest. This is why self-disclosure is so powerful in relationships. The more you share, the more you trust, and the more you trust, the more you share. It's a beautiful cycle that can transform a good relationship into an extraordinary one. In the following weeks, I started applying this lesson to my English learning in general. I stopped trying to sound like a native speaker. I stopped being ashamed of my accent. I started embracing my identity as a language learner, complete with all its imperfections. When I didn't know a word, I would say, "How do you say this?" instead of pretending I knew. When I made a mistake, I would laugh and say, "Sorry, my English is learning." And you know what? People were so much kinder to me when I was honest about my struggles. They would slow down, explain things differently, and even share their own stories of learning a second language. My honesty created connection. And that connection, in turn, created more opportunities for learning. So here's what I want you to take away from this part of my story. If you're learning English, if you're struggling with the language, if you feel like you'll never get it right, please stop trying to be perfect. Perfection is the enemy of progress. It's the enemy of connection. It's the enemy of love. Write that messy letter. Speak that broken sentence. Make those mistakes. And trust that the people who are meant to be in your life will not judge you for your imperfection. They will love you for your courage. They will honor your effort. And they will stay, not in spite of your mistakes, but because of them. In the next section, I'll tell you about the call that changed everything, the phone call from my mother back in Vietnam that gave me the final push I needed to step into my new life, and the beautiful conversation that taught me that mothers in any language speak the same language of love. The mother's voice. You know that moment when you've been holding your breath for so long that you forget you're even doing it, and then something happens that makes you finally exhale? That was me the day after I wrote that letter. I had poured my heart out to Michael. I had told him everything, and then I had spent the next 24 hours in a state of suspended animation, waiting, wondering, hoping, and terrified all at once. But the exhale I was about to experience didn't come from Michael. It came from a voice I hadn't heard in almost a year, my mother's voice. She called me at 6 a.m., which was 7 p.m. her time in Vietnam, and when I heard her voice crackling through the phone, I immediately started crying. Not because I was sad, but because I was homesick. Because I missed her. Because I needed her wisdom more than I had ever needed anything in my entire life. And what she said to me that morning, in her gentle Vietnamese, was the final push I needed to stop being afraid and start living the life I was meant to live. My mother, you see, is not a woman of many words. She's a practical woman, a farmer's daughter who has spent her whole life working with her hands and her heart. She didn't go to university. She doesn't speak English. She has never left Vietnam. But she has a wisdom that no amount of education can give you, the wisdom of a woman who has lived through war, poverty, loss, and still managed to raise 3 children with love and dignity. When she called me that morning, she didn't ask about my job or my apartment or any of the things I thought were important. She asked, "Con, are you happy? Are you loved? Are you loving?" And I couldn't lie to her. I never could. So I told her the truth, that I was scared, that I had found a man and a child that I loved, but that I didn't know if I was good enough for them. That my English was still broken, that I didn't know how to be a mother to a child who already had one, that I felt like I was pretending to be someone I wasn't. And my mother, in her simple, unadorned way, said something that changed everything. She said, "Con, you don't have to be perfect. You just have to be present. You don't have to speak perfectly. You just have to speak from your heart. You don't have to replace anyone. You just have to add your love to theirs. And if they love you back, that is enough. That is everything." I sat there, holding the phone, tears streaming down my face, and I felt a weight lift off my shoulders that I'd been carrying for years. My mother, who didn't speak a word of English, who had never met Michael or Leo, who had never even seen America, understood exactly what I was going through. Because love is the same in every language. Fear is the same. Hope is the same. The human heart speaks a universal language that transcends words, and my mother knew that language intimately. She had learned it through a lifetime of loving people who weren't perfect, of forgiving people who had hurt her, of showing up for her children even when she had nothing left to give. And now she was passing that wisdom to me, across an ocean, through a phone line that crackled with static but carried a message so clear it was almost visible. Now, I want to talk about the science of this for a moment because it's truly remarkable. When we experience emotional connection with someone we love, our brains release a chemical called oxytocin. This hormone is sometimes called the bonding hormone or the love hormone, and it plays a crucial role in forming attachments, building trust, and reducing stress. When my mother spoke to me, even through the phone, even in a different language, the familiarity of her voice, the warmth of her tone, and the love in her words triggered an oxytocin release that literally calmed my nervous system. I went from feeling anxious and overwhelmed to feeling grounded and safe in a matter of minutes. This is why talking to loved ones is so powerful when you're struggling with something difficult. The sound of a familiar voice can reset your brain chemistry. And in that moment, I needed that reset more than I needed anything else. But the most powerful part of my mother's call was what she said next. She told me about her own struggles as a young wife and mother. She told me about the war, about losing her home, about raising children with almost no food, about the nights she couldn't sleep because she was so worried about the future. She told me about my father, who wasn't perfect, who had his own flaws and failings, but who loved her and loved us in his own way. She said, "Con, there is no perfect life. There is no perfect love. There are only people who try, people who show up, people who choose each other, even when it's hard. And if you and this man can choose each other, if you can choose this child, then you have already succeeded. The rest is just details." And she said something else that I'll never forget. She said, "I didn't raise you to be a perfect woman. I raised you to be a brave one. And brave women don't run away from hard things. Brave women walk toward them, even when they're scared." That was the moment I knew I could do it. I could be a stepmother. I could love a child who wasn't biologically mine. I could build a life with a man who had a past. I could speak English with an accent and make mistakes and still be worthy of love. Because my mother had given me permission to be imperfect. My mother had reminded me that I was already enough. And if the woman who knew me best in the world believed in me, then I could believe in myself. I want to share something else my mother said because I think it's important for anyone who is learning a new language or building a new life. She said, "When I was young, I didn't know how to read. I learned when I was 30 years old because I wanted to read the newspaper and understand what was happening in the world. I made so many mistakes. I read so slowly. People laughed at me sometimes. But I kept reading. And now I can read anything. You are learning English the same way. You are starting slow. You are making mistakes. But every day, you are getting better. And one day, you will read and speak and write without thinking. Just like I read Vietnamese now, without thinking. It takes time, but it happens. Just don't give up before it happens." And I realized that my mother, who had never been to school, had learned more about learning than any textbook could ever teach me. She understood that mastery comes from persistence, not from perfection. She understood that the key to learning anything is to keep showing up day after day, even when it feels like you're getting nowhere. That phone call also taught me something profound about the connection between language and identity. When we learn a new language, we often feel like we're losing a part of ourselves. We worry that if we speak differently, we'll become different people. But my mother's call reminded me that our identity is not in the words we speak. It's in the love we carry. I could speak English perfectly and still be my mother's daughter. I could adopt American customs and still carry Vietnamese values in my heart. The two were not in conflict. They were in harmony. I could be both Vietnamese and American. I could be both a daughter and a mother. I could be both a student and a teacher. And the more I embraced all of these parts of myself, the more whole I felt. In the weeks that followed that phone call, I started to see my life differently. I stopped treating English as a barrier and started treating it as a bridge. I stopped thinking of Leo as someone else's child and started thinking of him as someone I could love with my whole heart. I stopped worrying about whether I deserved to be happy and started simply allowing myself to be happy. And everything started to shift. Michael noticed it. Leo noticed it. Even my coworkers at the small Vietnamese restaurant where I worked noticed it. I was lighter, freer, more myself than I had been in years. And here's the most beautiful part. When I told Michael about my mother's call, about her words of wisdom, about how she had given me permission to be imperfect, he just smiled and said, your mother sounds like an incredible woman. I would really like to meet her someday. And I realized that I wanted that too. I wanted my mother to see this life I had built. I wanted her to see the man I loved and the child I was learning to love. I wanted her to see that her daughter had not only survived but had thrived. And I knew that when she finally visited, we wouldn't need perfect language to communicate. We would have something far more powerful, love. So here's what I want you to take away from this part of my story. If you're learning English, if you're building a new life, if you're feeling like you're not enough, please, I'm begging you, call someone who loves you. Call your mother, your father, your sister, your friend. Let them remind you who you really are. Let their voice be the anchor that keeps you steady when the waves get rough. And remember that the people who truly love you don't love you for your perfection. They love you for your heart. They love you for your effort. They love you for your bravery. And that love, my friends, is the most powerful motivation in the world. In the next section, I'll tell you about the day everything came together, the family dinner where we finally understood each other. The moment Leo said something that made my heart explode, and the realization that we were no longer just a couple trying to figure things out. We were family. The family gathering. You know that feeling when you're standing at the edge of something terrifying, and you know that if you jump, everything could change forever. But you also know that if you don't jump, you'll spend the rest of your life wondering what could have been? That was me on a warm September evening, standing outside the door of Michael's parents' house, holding a dish of Vietnamese spring rolls that I had spent 4 hours making and feeling like my heart was about to pound right out of my chest. Michael's family had invited me to their annual fall gathering, and this was not just any gathering. This was the gathering. The one where all the relatives would be there, the ones who had heard about me but never met me. The ones who had questions and opinions and probably a few doubts about the foreign woman who had come into their son's life and was now, somehow, becoming part of their family. I had been nervous about this moment for weeks. I had practiced what I would say. I had rehearsed my introduction. I had even looked up the names of everyone I was going to meet, so I wouldn't forget them. But as I stood there, holding my spring rolls, my heart pounding, I realized that no amount of preparation could have prepared me for what was about to happen. Because this wasn't just a dinner. This was my baptism into a new family. And families, as I was about to learn, are messy, unpredictable, and absolutely wonderful. Michael opened the door and took my hand. You look beautiful, he said, and I wanted to believe him, but my stomach was doing somersaults. He led me inside, and the first thing I saw was chaos. Beautiful, loud, joyful chaos. There were people everywhere, talking and laughing and eating and drinking. There was a dog running around somewhere, barking at the children. There was music playing in the background, something old and American that I didn't recognize but somehow felt familiar. And there, in the middle of it all, was Michael's mother, Elaine. She was a small woman with silver hair and the kindest eyes I had ever seen, and when she saw me, she immediately came over and gave me a hug that felt like coming home. She said, I've heard so much about you. Welcome to our family. I was so surprised by her warmth that I almost forgot my script. I just said, thank you. I am happy to be here. And I was. In that moment, despite all my fears, I was genuinely happy to be there. The dinner was overwhelming in the best way. There was so much food, turkey and mashed potatoes and green beans and cranberry sauce and pies and cakes and everything you could possibly imagine. And there, in the middle of the table, were my spring rolls, looking small and humble compared to the feast around them. But when people started eating them, something magical happened. They loved them. They complimented me. They asked me about Vietnam and the food and the culture, and they listened with genuine curiosity. Michael's uncle, a big man with a booming voice, said, "These spring rolls are the best thing I've eaten all year. You have to teach my wife how to make these." And his wife, who was sitting next to me, laughed and said, "Yes, please. I've been trying to make them for years, and they never turn out right." And I felt myself relax, just a little. I felt myself starting to belong. But the real moment came later, after dinner, when everyone was sitting around the living room, telling stories and laughing. Leo was sitting on my lap, which was a surprise in itself. He had never been so physically affectionate with me before. And then, without any warning, he looked up at me and said, "Can I tell you something?" I leaned in, and he whispered in my ear, in his sweet, innocent voice, "I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you're my mom." My heart stopped. I looked at Michael, who was watching us with tears in his eyes, and I realized that this was it. This was the moment I had been waiting for. This was the moment when all the fear, all the doubt, all the uncertainty melted away, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that I was exactly where I was meant to be. Now, I want to talk about the science of family integration because this moment was not just emotional, it was also deeply neurological. When we form attachments to new people, especially in a family context, our brains go through a process called social bonding. This involves the release of multiple neurochemicals, including oxytocin, dopamine, and serotonin, which create feelings of trust, pleasure, and belonging. The more positive interactions we have with a group, the stronger those bonds become. And the brain, being the incredibly adaptive organ that it is, starts to treat these new people as family, even if there is no biological connection. So when Leo said those words to me, my brain was flooded with these bonding chemicals, and I felt an almost physical sense of belonging. It wasn't just an emotional experience, it was a biological one. My brain was literally rewiring itself to include this child, this man, this family as part of my identity. But the evening wasn't over yet. Later, as the night was winding down and people were starting to leave, Michael's father, a quiet man named Robert, pulled me aside. He had been watching me all evening, I realized, not in a judgmental way, but in a curious, assessing way. And now he wanted to talk. He said, "I want to tell you something. When Michael first told us about you, I was skeptical. I didn't think it could work. You came from such a different world. You had a past. You had pain. I worried about my son, and I worried about my grandson." He paused, and I felt my stomach drop. This was it, I thought. This was the rejection I had been dreading. But then he smiled, a warm, genuine smile, and continued. "But tonight I saw you with Leo. I saw how he looked at you. I saw how you looked at him. And I realized that I was wrong. You are not a threat to this family. You are a gift. And I want to thank you for loving my son and my grandson the way you do." I didn't know what to say. I just hugged him, and I felt another piece of my heart click into place. The drive home that night was quiet. Leo was asleep in the back seat, exhausted from all the excitement. Michael was driving, his hand resting on my knee. And I was sitting there, feeling a peace I had never known. I thought about my mother back in Vietnam, and I realized that she was with me too. Her love, her wisdom, her courage, it was all part of me. And now I had a new family, a new set of people who loved me, a new home where I belonged. The most beautiful part of that evening wasn't the grand moments, it was the small ones. The way Leo's aunt pulled me aside to ask about my skincare routine. The way Michael's grandfather told me a long, rambling story about his time in the military, and I pretended to understand every word. The way the dog, a golden retriever named Buddy, kept coming over to sniff my shoes and then wagging his tail like he approved of me. It was in those small moments, the ones that don't make it into movies or novels, that I felt the most loved. Because family is not about big declarations or dramatic gestures. Family is about showing up, being present, and letting yourself be known slowly and gently over time. Here's something I realized that night that I want you to understand, especially if you're trying to build a new life in a new country. When you're an outsider, it's easy to feel like you'll never belong. It's easy to look at families and think, they have something I can never have. But that's not true. Belonging is not something you're born with. It's something you build. It's built through shared meals, through patient listening, through showing up even when you're scared, through letting yourself be vulnerable and trusting that others will hold your vulnerability with care. It's built one small moment at a time until one day you wake up and realize that you're not an outsider anymore. You're family. That night, as we pulled into the driveway, Leo woke up and mumbled something in his sleep. What did he say? I asked Michael. He said, I want Mai to tuck me in, Michael replied, with a smile that lit up the dark car. And I knew, in that moment, that everything was going to be okay. Not perfect, but okay. Because I had found my place. I had found my people. And I had found a love that didn't require me to be anyone other than who I was. A woman with a broken past, a funny accent, and a heart that was learning, slowly but surely, how to love again. In the next and final section, I'll tell you about the wedding, the beautiful, simple ceremony that brought everything together, and the lesson I learned about second chances, that they're not about erasing the past, but about making peace with it and building something new on top of it. Because the best stories, my friends, are the ones that don't end when the pain stops. They end when the healing begins. The happy beginning. You know that feeling when you've been through so much that you almost can't believe something good is finally happening. And even as you're experiencing the joy, a small part of you is waiting for the other shoe to drop. That was me on the morning of my wedding day. I woke up at 5 a.m., unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling of my tiny apartment, and I thought about everything that had led me to this moment. I thought about the marriage that had failed, the husband who had told me I wasn't enough, the years of trying to have children and failing, the single suitcase I had packed when I left Vietnam, the freezing winter in Chicago when I didn't know if I would survive, the bookstore where I met Michael, the struggle to learn English, the battle to win Leo's heart, the cultural maze, the honest scars, the daily practice, the simple letter, my mother's voice, and the family gathering where I finally felt like I belonged. It had been a long, winding, painful, and beautiful journey. And now, here I was, about to marry the man I loved and become the stepmother of a child I adored. It didn't feel real. It felt like I was dreaming. But when my mother walked into my room, having flown all the way from Vietnam to be with me on this day, I knew it was real. I knew that my new life was about to begin. The ceremony was small and simple, exactly what I wanted. There was no big church, no hundreds of guests, no elaborate decorations. Just a garden behind Michael's parents' house, a beautiful arch covered in flowers that his mother had arranged herself, and about 30 of our closest family and friends. I wore a simple white dress that I had found at a small boutique, and I held a bouquet of wildflowers that Leo had helped me pick. Michael was wearing a light blue suit that matched his eyes, and when I walked down the aisle toward him, I saw tears streaming down his face. I started crying too, because I had never seen a man look at me the way he was looking at me in that moment. Like I was the most precious thing in the world. Like I was a miracle. And then, when I reached him, Leo walked over and stood between us, holding a small piece of paper. He looked up at me with those big brown eyes and said, "Mai, I wrote something for you." And he read it out loud, in his simple, 6-year-old voice. "I love you, Mai. You are not my mom, but you're my other mom. And I am so happy you're here." Everyone in the garden was crying, including Michael's father, who I had never seen cry before. And I knelt down, hugged Leo, and said, "I love you too, Leo. And I will always be here. I promise." The science of this moment is something I think about often. When we experience deep emotional connection, our brains release a cocktail of neurochemicals, oxytocin for bonding, dopamine for pleasure, serotonin for well-being. These chemicals create a state of intense emotional resonance that makes the experience feel almost transcendent. But here's the fascinating thing. Research has shown that these bonding experiences are actually enhanced when they are shared with a community. The presence of others who love and support us amplifies our brain's response to positive events. So when I walked down that aisle, surrounded by people who had accepted me, who had welcomed me into their lives, who had chosen to love me, I wasn't just feeling happy. I was experiencing a profound neurological reward that reinforced my sense of belonging and validated my place in this new family. The ceremony itself was a beautiful blend of Vietnamese and American traditions. We had the traditional Vietnamese tea ceremony, where Michael and I served tea to our parents as a sign of respect and gratitude. My mother, who had never met Michael's parents before, was crying as she accepted the tea. Michael's mother hugged her and said something in English that my mother didn't understand, but the warmth of the gesture transcended language. Then we had the American tradition of exchanging vows and rings. Michael had written his vows in both English and Vietnamese. He had practiced for weeks, trying to get the pronunciation right. And when he said, "I love you" in Vietnamese, my mother gasped and started crying even harder. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. Two families, two cultures, two worlds coming together in a celebration of love. After the ceremony, we had a small reception with food from both cultures, American barbecue and Vietnamese spring rolls, mashed potatoes and sticky rice, apple pie, and mango pudding. Leo, who had appointed himself the official taste tester, made sure to try everything at least twice. And my mother, who had never tried American food before, was fascinated by everything. She kept asking me, "Con, what is this? What is that? How do you eat this?" And I would explain in Vietnamese, with Michael translating to his family in English. It was chaotic and imperfect and absolutely beautiful. Because that's what families do. They adapt, they learn, they find ways to understand each other, even when the words aren't there. At the end of the night, when most of the guests had left and the garden was quiet, Michael and I were sitting on a bench, watching the stars. Leo was asleep in his grandfather's arms, and the whole world felt peaceful. Michael turned to me and said, "Mai, do you remember that first day in the bookstore? When you couldn't say anything, and I thought you were the most interesting person I had ever met." I laughed. I remember. I was so embarrassed. I wanted to disappear. He shook his head. "I'm so glad you didn't disappear. I'm so glad you stayed. Because you changed everything for me. You changed everything for Leo. You gave us hope when we didn't have any. You showed us that love doesn't need perfect words. It just needs a willing heart." And I realized in that moment that this was the lesson I had been learning all along. Love is not about what you say. It's about what you do. It's about showing up. It's about being honest. It's about being present, even when it's hard. It's about trusting that your broken pieces can come together to form something beautiful, as long as you're willing to try. Now, I want to talk about the title of this video, saying, Stepmom, without sadness / can broken pieces build stronger? Because that's the question I have been asking myself throughout this entire journey. Can broken pieces build stronger? And the answer, my friends, is yes. Absolutely yes. But not because the broken pieces magically become whole. Not because the pain disappears or the scars fade away. The pieces build stronger because we learn to hold them together with love. Because we choose to see the beauty in the cracks. Because we realize that our imperfections are not weaknesses, but doorways to deeper connection. When we share our brokenness with others, we give them permission to share theirs. And in that mutual vulnerability, we create a bond that is stronger than any perfect, unblemished relationship could ever be. I have read research on something called post-traumatic growth, which is the positive psychological change that can occur after experiencing adversity. The researchers found that many people who go through difficult experiences actually emerge stronger, more resilient, and more appreciative of life. They learn to value relationships more deeply. They discover inner strengths they didn't know they had. They develop a greater sense of compassion for others who are suffering. And they find new meaning and purpose in their lives. That is exactly what happened to me. I didn't just survive my past. I grew from it. I learned that I was stronger than I thought. I learned that I could love even when I was scared. I learned that I could trust even when I had been betrayed. And I learned that I could build a new life, piece by piece, even when the old one had crumbled. So here I am at the end of the story, and I want to leave you with this. If you're struggling with English, if you feel like you'll never get it right, if you're trying to build a new life in a new country, if you're carrying pain from the past, if you're afraid to love again, if you're wondering whether you'll ever belong, please don't give up. Please keep showing up. Keep making mistakes. Keep learning. Keep trusting. Keep opening your heart, even when it's scary. Because somewhere out there, there is a person, a family, a community waiting for you. They are waiting for your broken pieces because they have broken pieces of their own, and they know that when broken pieces come together, they can create something breathtakingly beautiful. My journey is not over. It will never be over. Because love is not a destination. It's a practice. Every day, I have to choose to show up for Michael and Leo. Every day, I have to choose to be honest, to be present, to try my best. Every day, I have to choose to say stepmom without sadness, to embrace the role I have been given with gratitude and joy. And every day, I am grateful for the journey that brought me here, for the pain that made me strong, for the mistakes that taught me wisdom, for the love that healed me. So, thank you for listening to my story. I hope it has inspired you, encouraged you, and reminded you that you are not alone. Your journey is your own, but you are part of a larger human story, a story of resilience, of hope, of love that transcends language and culture and borders. And in that story, you matter. You matter so much. Before you go, I want to leave you with one final thought, something I wish someone had told me when I was standing in that airport with my single suitcase, terrified and alone. You are not your mistakes. You are not your accent. You are not your broken English or your imperfect grammar. You are the courage that keeps you trying. You are the hope that keeps you showing up. You are the love that keeps you believing, even when everything seems impossible. The most powerful love letters in the world are not written in perfect prose. They are written in broken sentences, by people who refuse to give up. And that, my friend, is exactly what you are doing right now. So, I have a question for you. What is your broken sentence? What is the story you are too afraid to tell? The language you are too nervous to speak? The love you are too scared to give? And what would happen if you started anyway? Here's my challenge to you. In the comments below, write one sentence in English. It doesn't matter if it's perfect. It doesn't matter if it has mistakes. Just write something. Your name, your dream, your fear, your hope. And if you found value in this story, please do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. I will be making more videos like this, with more stories, more lessons, and more practice for your English journey. We are building a community here, a community of learners, of dreamers, of people who refuse to let broken pieces stop them from building something beautiful. Because remember, your accent is not a flaw. Your mistakes are not failures. Your broken English is not a weakness. It is a sign of your courage. It is proof that you are trying. It is evidence that you are growing. And that, my friend, is the most beautiful thing in the world. So thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to my story. And thank you for being part of this journey. I can't wait to see what you build with your broken pieces.